All right, hey everybody. Today I'm sitting down with Danny Kim. He is the Director of People, Culture, and Diversity at San Diego Foundation and was also Director of People and Culture at Raindrop Agency here in San Diego, a great marketing firm. We circled each other a lot over the years here in San Diego in the nonprofit space. Great guy. He's got a huge heart. Danny, thanks for sitting down with me.
Thanks. It's great to be here with you.
Good, good. We should have some fun. So, tell everybody a little bit more about how you got here in this idea of helping companies build healthy culture.
Yeah, so one of the things that I realized early on in my career was I was more passionate about helping people than fixing them. I was actually pre-med and I thought my career path and journey would be into the medical field, but what I realized was I was really passionate about how do people work? What makes them tick? What energizes people? And so, really, my early days kind of starts off in the Clifton Strengths world, doing Clifton Strengths consulting and coaching with Mike Doffany and the Doffany Group, and that really kind of catapulted me into kind of this understanding of what does it look like to provide opportunities in the workplace. And so I didn't know this at the time, but I came to a path where I was studying industrial organizational psychology. I was doing leadership and executive coaching, worked for a couple different consulting firms, and then found myself internal at an organization doing people and culture work. And a lot of people ask, what's the difference between HR and people and culture? And I think there's a lot of crossovers. And quite frankly, in my world, I oversee HR. But the way I would differentiate it is my kind of sole objective is to support and elevate the entire employee experience. And sometimes HR can be relegated to just like payroll or compliance or legal. But I really like to think of it from everything from the very beginning of like recruiting, leader development, everything in between, and then retention. How do we close the back door, so to speak? So really thinking about our team and our internal stakeholders, which is our people.
That's awesome. And I knew we'd find more ways to overlap. So, your time with the Daphne Group, they helped us
Yep.
at 50, which was
Yep.
fantastic
Yep.
to learn how everybody was different from a strengths perspective, and for Mike to
Yeah.
be able to go group to group and be like, okay,
Yep.
take these two people. Let me know if this sounds familiar. Do
Mm-hmm.
they go off in a room and just power ahead and come up with creative solutions and don't inform anybody? And and it was so easy for him to read those strengths and read the
Yeah.
people in the room, and such a
Yep.
beautiful way to analyze a business as people and relationships of people. It was so
Yep.
powerful for him to be able to just pin me down, like, tell me how many people need to hit Javan with a frying pan to get him to understand and hear what you're saying. And everybody's laughing. I'm like, you
Totally.
can see that from a strengths finder test. So
Yeah.
it's a cool way to analyze just how relationships work versus like, this is my
Yep.
job title, this is what I do. It's like, well, what emotionally fires you up is
Yep.
so much more about who you are and how you're wired than like the job and the job description. Or you think of hard skills and soft skills.
Yep.
It's such a dynamic kind of intersectionality of a lot of different things. So really cool to see
I
you
love
get to
that.
focus on that. That's awesome.
That's it. That's it.
So cool. Well, the first area that we wanted to touch on is this idea that's I have I don't want to say self-conscious, but I think a lot
Mm-hmm.
about, and Julie brought up, which is this idea of being a business for good and the
Mm-hmm.
idea of running a good business. So, in other words,
Mm.
it's the idea of a business with purpose versus a business that cares for its people, that cares for its clients, for
Mm.
the environment, right? And those are two
Mm-hmm.
different things. So, I wanted to think about that a little bit and just talk a little bit about what
Mm-hmm.
it looks like and what's important when you talk about running not a business for good, but just a good
Mm-hmm.
business. So I want to throw that over to you.
Mm.
What does that look like, and what are the components
Sure.
of that?
I mean, this is a complex question, because I think I love the way that you make that distinction because that's truly at the heart of it, right? And I would say the secret sauce is when you can meld those two realities together when you are a business for good and you are a good business, so to speak.
Mm,
But I think part of what how I would interact with that question is it takes a ton of energy, just like running a good
yeah.
business, meaning or doing a business for good. Like it takes ton of intentionality and investment, not just necessarily dollars, but in time and energy and paying attention. Sometimes it requires getting feedback that you're is not the most fun thing to do, right? Is
Yeah.
getting feedback and getting space where you're saying, I want to be honest with where we are, right? And so it's oftentimes I find leaders are aspirational, and sometimes they're blinded by their own vision, right? And I think I like to encourage leaders, including myself, where we have to do a diagnostic and say, what's going on? How do we begin to make the micro changes that we want to see within our business? And so when we are investing in our people, when we are investing in our talent, when we are paying attention to the sentiment and the needs of our people, especially, thinking about your business and my business, our people are our greatest assets at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
And that is something that I think is super important for us to never forget, right? We don't just build widgets. We have people, our minds, our creativity, our ability to create things into the world is one of the most important aspects of what we build and bring to the world. So I think, especially when you think about doing business for good, I think our hearts are in the right place. That especially nonprofit organizations, the one that I'm working in right now, we are trying to bring justice and equity and resilience into San Diego. That being said,
Yeah.
we also have to be mindful. My role is to be able to provide opportunities for us to pay attention to the people in whom we have, whether recruiting or keeping and retaining them.
Yeah, that's so cool. And it has to be done well. I see a lot of burnout, right, in the nonprofit space
Mm,
where the mission is what draws people in. I will call it
yeah.
like the external mission, right? The mission of San
Hmm.
Diego Foundation, beautiful. Like the idea of
Yeah. Right.
equity and building all, whether it's the housing funds or there's
Mm,
so many missions that the organization has that are
right.
fantastic. And from what I've seen, also great place to work. So you guys have something that you're
Yeah.
doing that's fantastic because everybody we meet with there is has been great people and really happy, but still with a larger spectrum. When I look at organizations and I look at employees and I look at how hard everybody has to work, like there's a lot of burnout in our space, and I think it's because
Mm,
not everybody does get this. And I recognize,
mhm.
you can look at a lot of reports that have come out in 2023 and 2024. Resourcing and staffing is one of the hardest things for nonprofits, and I
Mm,
think I'm being a little speculative here, but I think it's
mhm,
because of how hard it is to be dedicated to that external mission, but
mhm.
not lose sight of the fact that there's also an internal mission or an internal job you have when you want to be
Yeah.
that good business. You can't do it at the expense of what you have in your office, right? You can't, same way I struggle a bit to burn out my family, right? Like I'm working
Mhm.
hard to have a social impact business. It's more than just money, right? I use this
Right.
analogy that I'm
Right.
climbing a mountain, but it matters how we get there. I don't want to cheat
Mm,
my way up that mountain. I want to be a successful business owner, but I refuse to do it in a way that I'm not proud of in the end, right? So
yeah.
that
Yeah.
puts strain on my
Totally.
wife who has to deal with more when I'm working late, or I deal with a lot of very serious clients, right? And sometimes I unload
Mhm.
that. She's like, where I can't think about all this right now. I got like my own stuff, right? Or I'm busy with the
Mhm.
kids. And I think
Mhm.
nonprofits do the same thing, right? As we
Yeah.
struggle to take care of our employees, or I say our, but I guess
Yeah.
I would consider myself a social impact business, not a
Yes.
nonprofit.
Yeah.
And that's tricky, right? How do we
Yeah.
find balance there? And I think I want to throw that
Yeah.
over to you. How do we find balance between the mission of your team, which is, like
Mhm.
you said, that's your legacy, that's your intellectual property, is the team
Mhm.
and the way your team can work together. Balance that with
Mhm.
like we're going to work together to also have this beautiful thing we're going to create in the world.
Yeah, for sure. I think when I think about doing business for good, whether it's social impact or nonprofit space, or I even clump in like, healthcare industries or,
Hmm.
social impact industries. I think about people who are there because they are on mission together. They kind of know the end goal. And so in some ways there's like a galvanizing force where people come together and they know what they're about, right? In other organizations and different industries, it might be like, I'm just here to just make a paycheck. Well, that's it, right? But to your point, people in this space get into it because they're not necessarily just about making a ton of money. Like they could go into finance or go into something else, right? If they want to make a ton of
Yeah.
money. But there's kind of a heartbeat of saying, I want to make an impact. I mean, that's partly why I came to the San Diego Foundation, because I knew that my kind of chapter in life was I love my city. I love San Diego, and I know there's disparity in their region. And so can I make an impact? Therefore, I mean, I think that's the heartbeat of everyone. And that being said, you bring up a really great point. How do we find that balance? How do we find the ability to take care of our people? And I think something that's been pretty progressive that we've done at the foundation, obviously there's like the day-to-day workplace interaction, there's the work-life balance and week to week. But a few years ago, our CEO instituted every 5 years a sabbatical program that people are eligible for in their fifth year at the organization. So they get a month off and they come back to inbox zero, meaning you're not allowed to check your email, nor do you have emails to get back to, because we all know if you went out for a month, what kind of pain that would be coming back to an inbox full of emails. So I thought that was pretty progressive. I know that not every organization has the luxury of that, but I felt like that was a structural piece of saying, this matters to us. We want you here for the next decade, not just the next 2 years, right? We feel like we're putting kind of where our money, where our mouth is, in the sense of we're going to create structures and systems to allow people to take the time that they need. Now, I will say anecdotally, sabbaticals are not easy for those who are taking it. I've had many folks being like really having a hard time because they're like, I love to work. I love my job. I love my team. And so in some ways it's kind of like punishment. Yeah, exactly. They're like, I don't want to take time off. And so we've had to invite them into a process saying, what does it look like for you to release a little bit of that identity, so to speak, so that you can come back as a better leader, as a better partner, as a better community mate. And that's the goal at the end of the day, right? A break isn't a break just for the sake of a break. It's to come back refreshed, to get back to work, to do the things that you're most passionate about. So that's one structural thing we've done in order to really, put an investment back into our people.
Yeah, I like that. Two things. One, I could validate that feeling, right? If you said, hey, you got a month off, it always takes time to adjust, but it's so healthy. Like this first few weeks of any vacation, so a few days, I should say.
Yep.
You're just still in that go, go, go mode and progress and pushing towards productivity. I'm wired that way. So it takes a while for me to back off, to be like, oh, maybe I can pick up a book now. And it's so hard. We're in such a hurry culture that it, like, to even take a couple days just to get acclimated back to like, oh my gosh, this is what it feels like to just not worry about all that stuff is, for me personally, has been healthy. And I think the other thing you were mentioning around that sabbatical, what I like about that is it's not necessarily a metric, but it's a specific thing that you can turn to say, this is what this looks like. And I know larger corporations have that, right? You have ESG scores, or you have things where you're kind of being forced to think a little bit bigger than just producing revenue for the shareholders. But for smaller organizations too, I think it's so critical that you find metrics, right? And somebody said that to me. I wish I could credit who it was, but if you're not measuring it, do you really care, right? If all of your meetings and all your management meetings are around profitability and utilization, and they have to be, but if there are zero metrics around the team, around equity, around inclusion, around how are we doing to be a good business, then I think you have to kind of start to ask that question, right? Is it really a part of who we are as a company if when we go to actually measure what we're doing in the world, we don't measure that part of it? And I will also say, I'm thinking of my own metrics that I care the most about on a weekly basis. And this is what I was going to say earlier too, is it's easier to care about those things when everything's going good. It's harder. 2023 is pretty tricky for a lot, and in the agency world especially, it's a tricky year so far. And I'm sure if I could see faces of people listening, it would be a nod to that. Everybody I've talked to this year has been tumultuous already. And then you start to not necessarily make excuses, but you start to just not focus on that. It's like, I just need to make sure the doors are open and that everybody's got stuff to do. And I don't want to consider that an excuse. But I think oftentimes we use either our external mission or like, hey, things are, we just can't, I can't think about that right now. And I'm curious, how do we combat some of those excuses that we make as businesses to say like this, something like diversity, how do we make sure that doesn't fall off as like a nice to have when we really get down to the nuts and bolts of running our businesses?
That is a very tricky balance. And I think I empathize with any leader, business leader, whether executive team. I mean, it is one of the most tricky pieces is to figure out what are some of the foundational core elements of our business that are necessary to keep the lights on,
Mm-hmm.
and what are still mission critical but maybe take less of our energy or brain space immediately, because they are, I would say, more strategic or futuristic, right? And so my kind of philosophy and approach on that is, number one, understanding as a leadership team, or if you are working on a team, saying, what are our deliverables? What are the things that we can point to as saying these are metrics by which we're going to try to ascribe to, and then creating reasonable milestones and checkpoints. I think sometimes we as leaders, especially when it comes to like DEI, or when it comes to hiring and retaining and pay equity and all the things, like we almost set ourselves up for failure by having too large of a gap. Now, it doesn't mean we shouldn't be aspirational or try to have great goals, but I like to think about all of those people and culture topics. I like to say that you have to be bifocal. You have to be present with what's happening in front of you, but also futuristic, long-term planning. You have, you kind of have to have both intention,
Yeah.
because if you get too stuck on the future, then you miss the moment and the opportunities in front of you. And if you're too stuck in the present, you'll just be frustrated because you're like, why aren't we not there yet? And so creating the space and the language by which your team is aligned with what the mission is. I mean, even just as an example, like I just started at the foundation 4 months ago, and I had to tell my team, listen, I am very excited about DEI initiatives, whether that's trainings and events and learnings. That being said, I'm trying to make sure my team, our HR operations systems are in place before I can get there. So I just was very honest. Like, that's why you're not going to hear me talking about DEI as much right now. It doesn't mean it's not a focus for me. It just means that there's some other pieces that are fundamental that I need to make sure, like, do we have the right recruiting software? Because we've got so much going on. It's like, I got to make sure that's just dialed in. And then knowing, like, once we get head above water a little bit, then there's an opportunity for us to make some headway on some of the more, some of the aspirational goals that we have, right? And so whether
Yeah.
that's additional benefits or diversity hiring, or there's some other elements that I'm really looking forward to bringing to the table, but also keeping in mind there's a tension and we have limited capacity so that we don't burn out and we can
Yeah.
continue to do good in our businesses.
No, that's really cool. I think what I'm also thinking about here is whether that looks different in the world of nonprofit organizations and for-profit organizations. And really, a topic that we've had a lot over the last year or so is the trend towards those coming together, right? And what I mean is, for-profit companies are asked to have a missional focus, right? They're asked to have an inclusive business model or a product that has some version of a recycling initiative, or you're partnering, with developing
B
countries,
Corp. Oh yeah.
right? Yeah, there's some piece that, and it's beautiful. I think it's a bit of a demand generated element that people feel like they have to, as organizations, invest in some parts of either the supply chain or who they are, and then at the same time you have nonprofits that are being asked to be self-sustaining and have a sustainable revenue model. And you start to look at what both those businesses are and say they're really being asked to be the same thing: a business that can make money but be about more than just money.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to talk about that kind of from each way. What do for-profits do to create culture of purpose? We'll start there, and then how do nonprofits kind of work the other way around? So let's start with the for-profits, right? How do they kind of push for this idea of purpose in their culture in a healthy way?
Yeah, for sure. Well, at my time at Raindrop and other organizations, one of the things that I found to be most helpful in a for-profit entity was the leadership team cares deeply about people, right? Raindrop says they are people first company, and I solely believe that. They are passionate about who they bring on and every single person in the room. And so to me, what's very helpful in those kinds of situations is a for-profit company, because they don't necessarily have a mandate towards it. They don't have an expectation. They don't have anyone holding fire to their feet, so to speak. They can easily say, well, the bottom line is, revenue or operational efficiency or squeezing as much as we can out of people. But when you begin to create a culture where you are people first, you begin to think through, how can we be more generous with our benefits packaging? How do we provide support to our team? I know that's hard, and that's not an easy over the night solve because there's a real business reality to it. But I think it's the posture, right? It's the posture of how do you shape your culture? How are you thinking about it? What are the rituals that you're going to do as a team that's going to create the sense of safety and a sense of support? And so I think I've always felt that way, not only at Raindrop, but other organizations where they were, even though they were for profit, there was a bent towards a people centered elevation, right? Where these
Yeah.
people mattered to us. They weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, right? And
Yeah.
and so that's one element. And I think some also other for-profit companies obviously can have a very clear directive saying we are going to have a percentage of our profits go to X enterprise, or
Yeah.
they can't volunteer days, giving away services. I think such a great opportunity to partner with for-profit organizations. Now the challenge is they don't have to do any of that, right? And
Yeah.
so I think that is the interesting piece where it has to be an intentionality. It's kind of like entropy. If you don't do anything, it just gets really messy. So you have to say,
Yeah.
how do we stay organized and keep that as a central priority, whether that's in our OKRs or our vision, our goals, as a company? How do we prioritize that? I think, any organization that prioritizes in a role like mine is trying to do that, right? They're saying, hey,
Yeah.
we want somebody that is an expert in this field to be kind of the stake in the ground, saying when things are going this way and that way, or left or right, Danny or the people and culture person is going to help be a light in that space and saying, hey, this is how
Yeah.
people are feeling, or this is what things we need to do to adjust, or here's what I'm sensing and noticing, and this is how I think we should move forward. Obviously using data, but also just listening to people. That's part of a core part of my job. And
Yeah.
then, oh yeah,
No, no, go.
do you want to double tap on that, double click on that, or do you want me to go into the nonprofit space?
Well, yeah. Let me throw in one piece. I mean, I think
Yeah.
what I've come to recognize, because I think my brain is, I think, different than a lot of people. My brain goes to my kind of belief and heartstrings are tied to the far away and not to the local. Most people are
Mm,
connected to who they can experience on a day to day, and their mission goes from like their family to their network and out. And you see that in giving.
mm,
You see that most people give to their church, to their
mm-hmm,
kids' school, to the community.
mm-hmm.
And to me, I go the opposite. I feel like what is around me is not something that needs me. These are people
Mm,
that are all on mission with me, and it's to a fault,
mm,
right? I think we've had my wife and I've had
mm-hmm.
conversations around that, because it's like sometimes our core needs you in to not be on mission for something in Africa or some big huge
Yes,
global issue that you're trying to make a dent in. And
yes,
so it's beautiful to
yes.
think for a business they don't have to say that, hey, all of their coffee is made by
Mm,
either people in another country, or maybe there's some, your work you're doing with ex-convicts or something,
yeah,
formerly incarcerated. That's beautiful. But when you have a company with employees, that is 100% enough to be your mission, which is they are
yeah,
human beings and our mission is them. And being people
yeah.
focused does not mean that all of you now have to take revenue and all these things and go external. You could say, look, as a knit together group of people in this company,
Mm,
we take care of each other and we put the money
yes,
and the resources and the time and our hearts into each other. And that
yeah,
is more than enough to be,
yeah,
like we said before, a good business. So I think that that's really
yeah.
cool.
Love that. Yeah, I totally agree. And again, the challenge is you don't have to do any of those. And I think that's the caution, right? As an organization where you're like, that's not our core business. It doesn't matter. And so there's
Yeah.
going to need to be an intentionality because the gravity is not in that space. Now, on the other hand, for nonprofit or social impact businesses, I find that in some ways it's easier because the mission is a bit more clear, right? There's,
Mm.
I don't know, fighting human trafficking to, environmental issues to education. So there's like some pretty distinct areas of focus where people are like, I am passionate about this. Therefore, that's why I'm coming to this space. And I think that's
Mhm.
really cool. So you don't have to convince anyone of the mission, if that makes sense. To your point, though, Javin, you're expressing that in some ways, though, that need to solve that issue, whatever that is, whether it's global or local, can be so consuming, right? Where
Yeah.
we sacrifice our own well being. We sacrifice our own mental health. We sacrifice our boundaries, right? Where you're working late night and on the weekends and you're at this event and you're supporting, you're doing volunteer pickups and
Hmm.
clean, all the things. I mean,
Yeah.
we just had some massive storms in San Diego, and our team was just all around that, but that can consume so much time, especially when it's like relief work like that. And my invitation there from a leadership standpoint is, what are we doing to create space for people to recoup and recharge, knowing that
Mm.
there are moments where there's high intensity, there's a lot of skin in the game, so to speak, there's a lot of stake, there's big stakes at certain moments, and so that can feel a bit all consuming. And so how do we create systems and structures to, one, mitigate that, but also to recognize that, saying, hey, thank you, great work, and we're going to continue to figure out how to operationalize these high intense moments so you're not like
Yeah.
going crazy by yourself, right? And so
Yeah.
really thinking through from a structural standpoint.
Yeah, and even to be an organization that can respond to those in the moment, right? And that's
Yes.
it's part of the mission of who San Diego Foundation is to jump into
Yes.
those issue areas. But
Yes.
even just as a local business, right? When there's flooding or there's any number of things,
Mm-hmm.
you want to say, hey, let's shut the office down for 3 days and just go be on mission right here. Let's just go do
Yep.
that and help people. And there's
Yep.
been fires that have come through my neighborhood where
Mm.
I live, and
Mm.
it was to just drive to where people are being sheltered and like spend the
Yeah.
time asking, seeing what you can do, seeing
Yes.
if there's anything you can bring up
Yes.
there, right?
Yep.
Um, but to balance that, right, and I'll be the first
Mm-hmm.
to admit that again, that's easy when times are easy, and how do you not make
Mm-hmm.
those excuses of,
Mm-hmm.
hey, well, times are tough, so can we have
Yep.
time to have somebody like Danny work with us, or do we have
Yes.
time to invest in our team building, or our time
Yeah.
off, or our
Yeah.
sabbaticals, or our
Yeah.
training, or our audit of our hiring
Yes.
practices, right? It's so
Yes.
easy for those things, and I don't, like we said earlier, it's this idea of kind of crawl walk run, we say a lot. And
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
if you're moving yourself forward, I don't want people to feel guilted in those spaces, right? But
Mm-hmm.
in a certain way, I do want people to be thinking about
Mm-hmm.
all of those pieces, right?
Yeah.
What type of business are we collectively creating if we're
Yes.
stressed out and we're pulling our hair out, and we
Totally.
can't be part of the communities that we're in? Local
Totally.
business, global, whatever. So it is tricky.
Yeah.
You first admit I don't have it solved, right?
Totally. And I think part of the unique opportunity is that culture is fluid and dynamic, meaning
Mm.
our places of work, whether it's 5 people to 500 people, um, each person that you add to the team brings a new opportunity, a new perspective. And so, why do I bring that up? I think it's important to pay attention to, especially business leaders who are trying to say, how do I activate my team, right, towards
Yeah.
good, perhaps, whether that's for the mission of our organization or beyond. And I think for me, I really like to think about paying attention, who's in the room and where's the energy? How do we respond and trust our gut and intuition, but also how do we create systems and processes and protocols so that there is some boundaries? I think that's our job as leaders, is saying,
Yeah.
love that we did the emergency relief, and this is what we're going to do moving forward, because we can't all just take 3 days off every month when there's an emergency. Like, right, there's got to be like, okay, let
Yeah.
me limit it to a couple hours a month that you can do relief work or whatever that is. And so I think it's creating systems and structures as well. I think that's so much of this conversation of culture creation. I think actually people are able to are able to thrive when they actually have containers, when there are some
Mhm.
guardrails. It's kind of like a kid in a playground. If you don't have the boundaries, like this is where you stay, the monkey bars, or it's just like a wild field where you have no idea what's out there, that's where actually there's more chaos, confusion, and pain. But if we create a bit of a container saying, this is what we can do, this is what we can
Mm.
provide. If you want to go volunteer out there, like there's other things and opportunities. We want to make sure you have space for that. But creating a container that people can then say, this is me doing good in the world through my organization, I think that's a really powerful opportunity.
Yeah, I like how you're saying that. Because I think when you first think about it, you almost feel like, well, people just aren't thinking about it, or they don't care enough. You kind of can put people in
Mm,
that like other space of, well, we care about it and you don't. And I don't feel that much
mm,
that way as much anymore as I do
mm,
it's just hard, right? I think a
Yeah.
lot more business owners feel the desire to do this, but maybe get
Yeah.
stuck in the actual the steps that it takes to actualize a plan or to create
Yes.
results. And so I'm curious
Yes.
from your perspective, you've done this in a handful of organizations and probably with
Yeah.
Daphne, you see it a lot too.
Yeah.
Um, like, what do you think is the biggest barrier there to people succeeding in building that culture? Because I don't think anymore it's intention. I think the intentions are growing more and more in
Yes.
alignment with where we want culture to go. There's just
Yes.
so many outside factors that kind of pull you
Yep.
away from this idea that I'm going to make a business. It's great for everybody and environmentally friendly, all these things that really
Yeah.
matter. But what do
Yeah.
you think are some of the things that are the biggest roadblocks to us making that happen?
Yeah, it's good. I think I'm going to speak to two different audiences. The first audience is for our leaders, right? Our people leaders, whether that's executive team or director level and above, where you have influence in the organization. My encouragement to you would say, let's pay attention to what's going on in the room and be a leader that can help elevate those other people around you. So
Mm,
you yourself as a leader may not have the energy and time, but you can certainly find people who are stepping up to the plate. Maybe they have an energy. Maybe they have a passion towards a specific topic that you're like, you know what? I want to see that come to life. My job is to champion you in that. So that's one way. The other side of the house, though, is those that are maybe contributors or maybe managers, but maybe don't have necessarily organizational influence. If I were you, don't wait, right? Don't wait for your leaders and
mm,
don't say, hey, why isn't the CEO like the first one there at trash pickup or whatever it is, that's a silly example. But I mean, oftentimes I find that other contributors in an organization, our job is to step in and say, where's the gaps and where can I step up and say, hey, I can help lead this or can I try this and ask for permission to do that. And if that mutuality exists in an org, I think there's a lot of success because the reality is
mm.
the higher level you are, the more responsibilities you've got. You've got a lot more going on. And so there's an opportunity for leaders to be champions and allies and sponsors, and then contributors in an organization to be the one activating and leading and guiding and moving forward into whatever that good is, whether that's a policy change, relief work, or whatever that,
Right.
emergency response to culture creation, truly at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think the original like business model that
Hmm.
I mean, I'm okay. Do we still get to call ourselves young? I guess not. I'm in my 40s. What I
Yeah, yeah.
learned as business is now called like
Yeah.
the traditional way of doing business, which is like there's
Mm.
all these other schools of
Mhm.
thought and hybrids and pods. But
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
that helps people understand that just because you have a C-suite or you have people ahead of you, leadership can come from anywhere, and the business
Yeah.
model has broken into so many different structures that I think
Yes.
a lot of people think, oh well, that's not my job, that's not something I'm,
Yeah.
but you can champion anything, and especially something like this that kind of
Yes.
sits on the side. You're not inventing the next product, you're not deciding
Yep.
the mission of the organization, but you're saying, hey, there's something here that I care a lot about and I can see us do
Hmm.
it better. And rather than complaining and rather than being the one who's like, I
Yep.
want this to be different, you say, hey, how about I spearhead something here? Can I do
Yes.
something? And can you support me in those efforts? I
Yes.
think that's beautiful. And that
Yes.
can come from anybody. I would speak from the leadership side of that and say that is my favorite thing, right? When I have a designer who's
Mhm.
like, hey, I want to go in this direction, I want to find tools that are going to do the following, or can we source our photography in a way that's more ethically defensible? Can we have our hiring practices be more representative? Like, and when they say,
Yeah.
let me do some of that work, it
So
takes
good.
the pressure off in a way that's like,
Yeah.
again, we go back to that idea of juggling the growth of a business. There's only so many things you can do,
Yep.
right? Another term
Yep.
I'm using a lot right now, to be open and honest, is boiling
Hmm.
the ocean. I
Hmm.
constantly
Hmm.
trying to boil the ocean. Too many things,
Hmm.
spinning too many plates. I'll help you do
Hmm.
that. I'll take that
Hmm.
on. DEI,
Hmm.
yeah, where is that? Why isn't it done? Let's get
Hmm.
it organized. And all of a sudden,
Hmm.
I can't even think straight, right? So that
Yeah.
idea of letting somebody else who maybe isn't in that same mentally spastic state of mind can
Yep.
come in and do that is a great thing. And again, to
Yeah.
inspire culture to allow people to be leaders in that space
Hmm.
is
Yeah.
seems like a win-win all around.
Totally. And I think for us as leaders that all have a lot going on is identifying who can support and lead this initiative, what do they need, and how do I make sure that they get in the right spaces in the right rooms, right? Like they're the
Yeah.
like they might not, maybe it's like, hey, person so and so, you're a designer, but you want to do some social impact for our organization and you want to lead a charge. Come speak to us at the executive team meeting.
Yeah.
Give us your pitch. We want to figure out how to give you energy and resources if that's the need. So I think there's a lot of creative ways we can delegate. I like to call it lazy leadership, but really the idea is being leaders that are saying, I see potential in you. Would you help us
Yeah.
create the culture we were striving for? And then the other thing I'll just make a quick pitch to is I just recently read a book called Impact Players by Liz Wiseman. Highly, highly, highly recommend it. But basically, she helps distinguish between two different kinds of people. She calls one type of people as contributors, people that do their job, do a good job, but do their job. And then impact players coming from the sports world, but like, that player that comes in and they're going
Yeah.
to change the game. They're going to change the outcome of the game. And she says that contributors do the job, do their job. Impact players do the job that's required. And I think that's an interesting distinction as we think about this idea of doing business for good. It's like, what's the job that is needed? What's ours to do as well? Because we can't do it all, to your point. Like we can't boil the ocean, but what's our responsibility? What's around us that we have the ability to influence? And how do we do that with passion, energy, support, moving forward? So anyways, it's just been something that I'm thinking about as I think about, are you being an impact player? Are you being an impact business
Yeah.
as you move forward, saying we can't do it all, but this is what we can do. We can do this really well, and that's
Yeah.
our contribution to the world.
And that ties really well to what you were saying before, and it's something I'm gonna get a little selfish here for a minute and
Sure.
take it's gonna be a therapy session for me, because that's what you crave as a leader is to focus on all those big moments where like I'm not just gonna take a shot. I'm gonna do something in the locker room that when we come back out of that room, we're all gonna play different, right? And you're gonna coach
Yeah.
like that's a
Yeah.
desire, but at the
Yes.
same time, I am wired to do. I am wired
Yeah.
to solve problems and craft, right? Like I'm down
Yes.
there sanding and
Yes.
grinding and drilling holes, right?
Yeah.
And it takes
Yeah.
a certain perspective shift
Yeah.
to be the person who coaches. And what I want to get back to is delegate and delegate in a way that is not like, hey, get some low hanging fruit stuff off my calendar, but delegates leadership and maybe even delegates more of those
Yeah.
power players, the people who are going to come in and who are going to change the game. And so I'm curious
Yeah.
if you have anything to speak to or advice around this idea of maybe I'll kind of label what I feel like I do as almost like a toxic delegation, which is like when I'm frantic, just can
Yeah.
you do that for
Last
me?
minute.
It's a mess,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Versus
Yeah.
like the taking the potential of somebody being a great leader and
Yeah.
proactively nurturing by saying like, look, here's something that I do and I'm going to give it to you and give it to you
Yeah.
to own it and be passionate about it versus I need it
Yes.
done tomorrow and can you take it off my plate?
Great question. I love this question. I mean, um, this is the art of management, right? And art of leadership, in my opinion, is so a couple things just from my career is number one, I always hire people that I believe can take my job. And being a business owner might be a different perspective, but for me, I'm literally like,
I might take that. That'd be great.
yeah, exactly. No, I mean,
Find the
I've told my
board.
last two hires, I'm like, hey, listen, I've hired you because I believe one day you could do my job, and once my job is done here, you will have this job, and and I'm fine. Like I think just holding that space, saying like I'm not the savior here in this place. Like I have a mission, and my job is to make sure I'm hiring amazing people to not only support me, but I believe that I can invest into and develop in the days to come. So that changes everything, right? For me, I'm thinking about what rooms are they going to be in, what meetings are they going to be in, what are the initiatives that they're going to take on? How do I balance push versus rest? How do I challenge them to stretch, but also don't burn them out, where they're feeling exhausted. And so I'm constantly thinking about that. But I think that I have found some of the best leaders to be great delegators, right? And sometimes it could come off as like they're just too busy and they just need to let go of things. But truly, there's a difference between, to your point, yeah, like there's a difference between just like frantic delegation, but also intentional strategic delegation where you're saying, I want you to do this because this will lead to this, which will lead to this, which will lead to that. It's like making sure that they're in the right development program and they're working with the right coach,
Yeah.
using a sports analogy, right? Where you're saying, hey, this is your diet, this is your nutrition program, and I need you to do this because one day you're going to be playing in the NBA, but right now you're G League, and I want to make sure that we're putting all the wraparound services for you to get to that place where one day you're on the bench and then one day you're a starter.
Yeah.
So I think for me, thinking of it that way, that's a long-term trajectory. But I see so many leaders, honestly, they haven't paused long enough to identify who the talent is around them, and then two, they don't have or they just haven't had the space and time to say, what can I do to intentionally give away what I'm doing? What are some elements of my role and my tasks that actually would be a strategic opportunity for somebody else? And that's hard because sometimes it's like letting go of opportunities where I'm like, hey, that should be me giving that presentation, or that should be me,
Sure.
presenting to the board or whatever. And
Yeah.
sometimes I'm going, who else can I elevate? Who else might be the better person to take this initiative on? And how can I be a key champion and ally in this space?
Yeah. Bro, because I honestly,
Well, I gotta take that hard a little
somebody
bit,
said
'cause
this to me.
that's, I think,
somewhere
early
where I
in
need to my career, and it feels that it was their personality, and so I felt validated in the way I feel. Which is, she said, "I'm always the one carrying the flag and running to the top of the mountain,
Yeah.
and I get there and I turn around and everybody's gone." And that pursuit of the product, the pursuit of the goal, at the expense of people, versus getting there
Yeah.
collaboratively,
Yeah.
getting there with the intention of like, if I get there and
Yes.
nobody's next to me, like I said it earlier, I'm wired to get to the top of the
Yes.
mountain. I care how I get there. What I'm
Yes.
referring to is I care about the products. I care about, and don't get me wrong, I don't. I
Yep.
do care about the people. I'm not. All my employees are watching,
Yeah.
are gonna question my morality
Yes.
here.
Yes.
But
Yes.
it's a muscle I
Yeah,
need to
yeah, yeah,
stretch
yeah.
and work, is to not forget that
Yeah.
right close to home is something equally
Yes.
as powerful.
Yes.
And that's all a part of it, right? Our services team is always like, no, it's not just the product, it's the way they feel as we make it. And it's how painful was it when we went through it. And I've luckily hired people that are complements
Yeah.
to that, right? Where I push so hard on the product being what I want it to be, and they push really hard on like, well, look, you're making it really painful for them.
Yep.
It's coming out great, but for a couple months there, like that was really hard for the client to, whether it's a
Yeah.
content phase or whatever else. How do we improve
Yeah.
it to where it's easier for us, easier for our team, easier for their team? It's
Yeah.
all kind of
Yeah.
interwoven, right? And we talked about it, we touched upon it at the very beginning, is that becomes the culture that you create where people don't burn out. And then we want to add that layer of like, well, are you inclusive in that? And can you make that non-burnout culture not just for you, but for everybody? And that's, I think, top to bottom in terms of leadership and production teams and pay scales, but also how do we hold ourselves accountable
Yep.
to create something that,
Yep.
like I said before, a lot of people are wanting to maybe hire better, be more representative of different ethnic groups or age groups or genders. And how do we retain that? And how do we make something
Yeah.
that is retained, or constantly you revisit and you kind of course correct
Yeah.
and ensure that you're continuing to do that? And that's something I've been thinking a lot about too, is I think our hiring
Yep.
has been strong in this space. I think we've been doing a great job at building diversity into that hiring process. Do we revisit it enough, or do we check often enough? Do we retain at the same rates? That's probably the next chapter for us. We talked about crawl, walk, run. I think now I'm getting into the walk, where I feel like the baselines internally have been made, and I think we've made a lot of progress. And now to take some steps forward, I want to figure out why why it's not naturally maybe happening, or why are we having maybe different rates of time of employees on staff. Or we've also looked at the projects that we take on, right? Do we skew more towards one cause versus another? Because again, our whole goal is to tell the stories of people out there changing the world. How do we decide and dictate, and do we have a process that fairly takes those causes on even, right? Or are we just kind of gravitating towards our own silo of relationships,
Yeah.
and we're only
Yeah.
telling this one story over here around educational inequality, but we're not looking at it from another lens and saying, look, I want all those
Right.
stories out there. I'm a big fan of free speech. I'm a big fan of letting
Yep.
our work get stories out there to resonate with whomever they are, regardless of their stance, right? And we can there's a lot packed
Hmm.
into that, but just something I'm wrestling with. And I feel like I just want to
Hmm.
be open and honest to other leaders that maybe feel like they're not in a
Yeah.
place or they're
Yeah.
embarrassed about where they're
Yeah.
at. Like I'm a little embarrassed about where we're at, especially claiming and pushing so hard that we're a social
Yeah.
impact business. Like I put that sticker on our business, and now I feel like I owe it to everybody to not mess any of these parts of the
Yeah.
business up, and
Yeah.
keeps you up sometimes.
Mm. Mm. Well, let me speak to that. So I think as leaders, we should always be dissatisfied with where we are, right?
Mm,
Or else we're just gonna coast, or we're like, I'm good, my job is done. I think there'll always be, especially someone that's so entrepreneurial like yourself and other listeners that are in that space, like you will always want more, right? You'll always want better, and that's the goal. That's life. That's called growth, right?
mm,
A tree doesn't stop growing. They always want more because they want more shade, they want more light, they want more, whatever that is. They want more fruit, and so we as leaders have to always want more. So we can't be satisfied with, with the status quo. That being said, I think it's becoming very clear, and I've becoming more and more passionate about this phrase. Is like, what's mine to do, right? In the sense of like,
mm.
what's my role, like that I'm uniquely fit for in this moment, in this space, right? To your point, I can't boil the ocean, and every cause will not be on my banner, right? Because I just can't. What I can do is make sure people feel like in my place of work, there's a sense of belonging, that they can be their whole selves at work, that they trust each other, and that they have each other's backs. I can trust that, or my commitment is to creating equitable processes and systems behind the hood. Honestly, a lot of things that a lot of people won't hear about, that isn't sexy, and that you won't be like, wow, Danny, you're really changing the world one process at a time. Like literally, like our practices of hiring or salary increases or whatever that is, a lot of that will be behind the scenes. And I think people have to be mindful that the work of DEI, culture creation, some of it is like not even visible to most people, right? And
Yeah.
we have to be okay as leaders saying this is the invisible work that is actually creating change in our society and our organization and changing lives of people, quite literally. So I just think that is really important for us to know as leaders. And then what are the things that are maybe visible, that are public oriented, that are going to be helping your clients rally around? Our work is very visible because it's in our community all over San Diego. So how do we do that with integrity? How do we do that with resilience? How do we do that with stability, even, right? Because that it doesn't help other people that we're serving if we're frenetic and fried out and burnt out. Our job is to say, how do we be the best version of ourselves? So we
Mm.
show up to those interactions, those meetings, those opportunities with a clear mind and clear eyes. So yeah, hopefully that helps. I mean, I'm just thinking about, sometimes it's easy, it's okay to have the tension of wanting more and better, and at the same time becoming clear with what's mine to do and being mindful of that dynamic and saying, who are the people who are going to help me do this? Because I think that's what we're creating alignment around. So
I like
whether
that.
you are a for-profit business or a social impact nonprofit, either category, I think there's an opportunity there to say, we want better. What does better look like for us?
I like that. I like that. And I think that just to be that practical about it, like what's mine to do.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many things that you can look at, but when really
Mm-hmm.
getting to that place of like, what of those things is even actionable? What are those things that are under my control that I
Mm-hmm.
can deal with? And that does take a
Yeah.
lot of that fluff and clutter and noise and
Mm-hmm.
chaos that I feel like bombards us, and you kind of shut it off
Yes,
because it's really outside of your control. So solid
totally.
advice. Let's take it away from me now, and just maybe end with a couple bits of advice. We talked kind of crawl, walk, run. What's maybe one small
Mm-hmm.
thing, one medium-sized thing, one kind of aspirational thing that people could do to really go inward on their companies and make sure that they're doing the right thing for their culture?
Yeah, it's great. So at the baseline, I think I know sounds so simplistic, but we as leaders need to pay attention. We need to listen better. I think there's so many times, even in my own world, where I jump into a meeting on 0 to 60, and I've got to dos and tasks to delegate and movement forward. And I'm actually coming in pretty fried already, so I'm frenetic and moving quick. And I think it really behooves leaders to pause and say, how are you doing? What's going on in your world? And pay attention to what's going on in their world. And there's a number of different ways you can gather data, surveys, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm a big fan of just making sure you sit down, have space and time to sit down with different leaders in your organization and say, help me understand what's going on. Where are the pain points? How are you doing? How are you showing up? What are the things that are making you energized? And what are the areas that we can doing better? What are areas that you're finding stress? So creating space to create that dialogue. I think the next step for me then is to begin to provide some infrastructure for your team to activate, right? If you are a leader that can actually create change, that doesn't mean you should be the change, right? Like, doesn't mean you need to be leading every committee or leading every DEI, initiative. I really believe, I'm a very strong believer in appointing people and saying, hey, it seems like you have a passion around this. I'm curious if you'd be willing to help me lead this up. And it could be for a season, it could be 6 months, it could be, a year, and say, hey, would you find a couple other leaders that you would help kind of elevate this? And I'll give you time at our status meeting. I'll give you time, if you need some budget, here's a small budget. Like, really creating structure so that others can lead that initiative, right? So maybe, it's in your space, Gavin. It's like, hey, I want to, we want to identify more diverse, photography or whatever. Create a system so people can help collate that and create that and say, hey, what's our policy or process by which we can create more equity in that space? So that's just one option. Like, kind of create these kind of subcommittees. I like to task force, whatever you want to call it, but that galvanizes them over around a mission that actually has an impact towards policy or operations, right? That then you're like, great, I heard it from y'all. Let me incorporate that. Let me approve that. Let's figure out how do we track that moving forward. And then the last thing I would just say is, for me, this is the space that I'm living in, is aspirationally, I am really thinking about equity across the board, right? Whether that's pay equity, gender equity, ethnic equity. I am thinking about what does it look like to level up diverse candidates or team members. I am thinking about best practices for performance reviews, merit increase raises, all of that. So to me, there is a massive infrastructural opportunity as people leaders to create systems that make things fair, and so I'm looking on a number of different ways, but that takes a lot of time, takes a lot of change management. That's me working with my team, working with our executive team, working with the board, and making sure. So there's a lot of moving pieces, and my job is to stay in it. My job is to stay in the game and to provide research and provide insights and recommendations and solutions so that we can have a more equitable organization. But that's all internal work, right? None of that no one will ever see. But my hope is that I can continue to create space for those conversations with the right people to then hopefully elevate our culture for the decades to come, right? That's my hope, is the small changes I'm making. I mean, I guess they're not small. The bigger changes that I'm making now should have an impact on their culture long term, and that's exciting. But that also takes time, right? When you get to that run phase, doesn't mean you're getting there faster. It actually means you're making bigger change that will have a bigger impact, but actually go slower in some way. So hopefully that doesn't mess up your analogy too much. But that's kind of where I'm thinking from a people and culture standpoint.
Sure, you can run in the wrong direction. That happens.
It's true. Yeah, totally.
Well,
ran up the wrong mountain.
Yeah, exactly. You can, and they may not see it, but they'll feel it, which I think that's the beautiful part, right? Is that they will feel the work that you do more than they'll hear it, which I think is authentic, and that's beautiful. And I would encourage organizations to continue to go down that route of focusing on people and the type of work that you do. So, I appreciate you sitting with me. I feel invested in having that conversation. So that's awesome. Hopefully other organizations feel the same. Other leaders feel the same. Maybe there's some nuggets that they got. And if they want to reach out to you and connect with you, where should they go?
Great place. I'm on LinkedIn. and Danny Kim, and then I'm sure we could put that somewhere.
We will.
And then on our website, sdfoundation.org. Love the team that's working there, and so if people want to learn more about what we do, happy to share that and dialogue that way.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time. Hopefully everybody got something out of it, and we'll catch you next time.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.